Some men bury their hearts with their wives. Marshal Colton Rigg thought he was one of them. After losing his beloved on the windblown hill above Black Mesa, he swore off love for good. His ranch ran lean, his heart ran dry, and folks in town stopped trying to bring cheer his way. Then Josie Mayfield showed up with dust on her boots and hunger in her eyes. When she heard him say love was a thing for other men, she smiled and said, "I can make you feel love again." Colton laughed, but he hired her anyway. What followed was a season of quiet miracles that changed everything. But what secret was Josie hiding that could destroy it all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bent horseshoe hung crooked above Colton Rigg's door, a reminder of luck turned sour and things that couldn't be straightened. He'd found it on his wedding day, 12 years past, when Sarah had laughed and said it meant their love would last forever. Now, it mocked him each morning as he stepped onto the porch of his ranch house, the wind carrying the scent of sage and the promise of another empty day. Black Mesa stretched before him like a sleeping giant, its red cliffs catching the first light of dawn. The land had been in his family for 3 generations, carved from the wilderness by men who understood that the frontier gave nothing without taking twice as much in return. Colton's grandfather had built the original cabin with his own hands, and his father had expanded it into a proper ranch house with whitewashed walls and a wraparound porch. Now Colton walked these same boards alone, his boot heels echoing in the silence. The morning routine never changed. Feed the horses, check the water troughs, mend whatever the night had broken. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory guiding him through tasks that once brought satisfaction. The Black Mesa ranch had been prosperous once, when cattle prices were high, and Sarah's laughter filled the house. She'd kept the books, managed the household, and somehow made their modest income stretch to cover everything they needed. Without her, the numbers didn't add up the same way. Doc Henderson had been the first to notice the change. He'd ridden out from town 3 months after the funeral, his weathered face creased with concern. "Colton, you're wasting away," he'd said, settling his considerable bulk into Sarah's favorite chair on the porch. "A man needs more than work to keep him going." But work was all Colton had left. Work and the weight of the marshal's badge he still wore, though he'd been thinking of turning it in. The badge had meant something when Sarah was alive, when he'd had a reason to come home safe each night. Now it felt like another burden, another responsibility he carried without joy. The town of Cedar Falls lay 5 miles down the winding dirt road, a collection of weathered buildings that had grown up around the railroad depot. Colton made the journey twice a week for supplies and to check in with Sheriff Martinez, who'd been covering most of the marshal duties since Sarah's death. The townspeople meant well, but their sympathy felt like pity, and their attempts at matchmaking made him want to ride in the opposite direction. Mrs. Henderson had been the worst offender, constantly mentioning eligible widows and spinsters who might bring some life back to that lonely ranch. She'd cornered him at the general store just last week, her eyes bright with mischief. "There's a lovely woman visiting from Denver, Colton, a schoolteacher, very refined." "I'm not looking for company, Mrs. Henderson," he'd replied, the same words he'd used a dozen times before. "But Sarah wouldn't want you to be alone forever," she'd pressed, her voice gentle but insistent. That was the problem. Sarah wouldn't want him to be alone. She'd want him to find happiness again, to fill the house with laughter and maybe children. But wanting and being able were different things, and Colton's heart felt as dry as the autumn grass, brittle and likely to crumble at the first strong wind. The financial ledger in Sarah's neat handwriting told its own story. Cattle prices had dropped, and without her careful management, expenses had crept higher. The ranch could survive another year, maybe 2 if he was careful. But the bank in Cedar Falls had been making inquiries, and Colton knew they were watching, waiting for him to slip far enough behind to justify foreclosure. He'd been considering his options when Josie Mayfield arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, walking up the long drive with nothing but a worn canvas bag and more determination than good sense. She wasn't what he'd expected when he'd placed the advertisement for ranch help in the territorial newspaper. Most men who answered such ads were drifters or men running from something, but Josie was neither young nor old, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and clothes that had seen better days but were clean and mended. "You Marshal Rigg?" she'd asked, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that spoke of places far from the high desert. "I am." He'd been shoeing a horse in the barn, and he straightened slowly, taking her measure. She was tall for a woman, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they knew work. Her face was pleasant enough, weathered by sun and hardship, but not bitter. Most importantly, her eyes held a steadiness that impressed him. "I'm here about the job," she'd said simply. "I can cook, clean, and handle cattle. I don't drink, don't steal, and I don't gossip. What I need is honest work and a place to sleep." "You're not what I expected," he'd admitted. "Neither are you," she'd replied, and there'd been something in her voice that made him look at her more carefully. "But I suspect we both need what the other's offering." That had been 3 weeks ago, and Josie had settled into the rhythm of ranch life as if she'd been born to it. She rose before dawn to start breakfast, worked alongside him through the day, and retired to the small cabin behind the main house each evening without fuss or complaint. She spoke when spoken to, minded her own business, and somehow made the ranch feel less empty without making demands on his attention. The cooking was a revelation. Colton had been surviving on beans and hardtack for months, but Josie produced meals that reminded him food could be pleasure as well as sustenance. She'd found Sarah's recipe book in the kitchen drawer where he'd left it, and though the sight of it had made his chest tight, he'd said nothing when she'd quietly begun using it. "Your wife had good sense about seasoning," she'd commented one evening over a stew that tasted like something from his childhood. "She had good sense about most things," he'd replied, and that had been the end of it. But now, watching her work in the garden Sarah had planted, Colton found himself wondering about the woman who'd appeared at his door like an answer to a prayer he hadn't prayed. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to make do with less, but there was something in her manner that suggested she hadn't always been poor. Her grammar was too good, her manners too refined, for someone who'd grown up rough. And there were the little things, the way she sometimes caught herself before speaking, as if she were choosing her words carefully. The way she startled at unexpected sounds, as if she were always listening for something. The way she sometimes stared into the distance with an expression that spoke of longing and regret. Sheriff Martinez had ridden out the week before, ostensibly to check on ranch business, but really to satisfy his curiosity about the new help. He'd questioned Josie politely but thoroughly, and she'd answered with the same steady calm she brought to everything else. Born in Louisiana, traveled west after the war, worked ranches in Texas and Colorado before coming to the territory. Nothing suspicious, nothing that raised red flags, but nothing that felt complete either. "She's running from something," Martinez had said after Josie had excused herself to tend to the chickens. "Question is whether it's something that's going to catch up with her." Colton had watched her through the kitchen window, noting the way she moved with purpose, even when she thought no one was watching. "We're all running from something," he'd replied. "Long as she does her work and doesn't bring trouble to my door, her past is her own business." But that night, lying in the bed that had felt too large and too empty for months, Colton had found himself thinking about Josie Mayfield and the secrets she might be carrying. He'd been a lawman long enough to recognize the signs of someone who'd learned to live carefully, always aware of her surroundings, always ready to move if necessary. It should have bothered him more than it did. Instead, what bothered him was the way the house felt different with her in it. Not happy, exactly, but less hollow. The way meals had become something to look forward to, rather than endure. The way he'd started noticing small improvements around the rancher patch in the barn roof, weeds cleared from the vegetable garden, tools properly cleaned and stored. Most troubling of all was the way he'd begun to sleep through the night, without dreaming of Sarah's last moments, without waking to the sound of her voice calling his name. The guilt of that peaceful sleep was almost worse than the insomnia had been. The bent horseshoe caught his eye again as he finished his evening chores, and for the first time in months, Colton wondered if things that were broken could sometimes be mended after all. The thought scared him more than he cared to admit, but as he watched lamplight flicker in the window of Josie's cabin, he couldn't quite push it away. Tomorrow would bring another day of work, another opportunity to pretend that having help was purely practical. But tonight, as he climbed the stairs to his empty bedroom, Colton Rig allowed himself to acknowledge a truth he'd been avoiding. The loneliness that had been his constant companion was finally showing signs of retreat. Whether that was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. The leather-bound recipe book lay open on the kitchen table like an accusation, its pages yellowed with age and stained with use. Sarah's careful handwriting filled each page measurements in her precise script, notes about which spices worked best, little drawings of herbs in the margins. Colton stood frozen in the doorway, his morning coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched Josie trace her finger along a recipe for apple butter. "Put that down." The words came out harder than he'd intended, sharp enough to make Josie's hand jerk away from the page as if it had burned her. She looked up, her face carefully neutral, but he caught the flash of something hurt, maybe, or embarrassment, before she composed herself. "I know what you were doing." Colton set his coffee cup down with more force than necessary, the sound echoing in the suddenly tense kitchen. "That book isn't for you to touch." Josie closed the book gently, her movements deliberate and respectful. "I apologize. I found it in the drawer yesterday when I was looking for a measuring spoon. You thought wrong." Colton reached for the book, but Josie's hand moved to cover it, not possessively but protectively, as if she understood its value in ways that went beyond recipes. "She loved to cook," Josie said quietly, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that made him want to look away. "I can tell from her notes. The way she wrote about making bread for you when you were sick, about trying that new cake recipe for your birthday." She paused, her thumb brushing against the worn leather cover. "She wanted to take care of you." "Don't," the word came out raw, scraped from somewhere deep in his chest. "Don't talk about her like you knew her." "I didn't know her," Josie agreed, her voice maddeningly calm. "But I know what it's like to lose someone you plan to grow old with. I know what it's like to have their things be the only pieces of them you have left." Colton's hand stilled on the book. Something in her tone, in the careful way she wasn't looking at him now, made the anger drain out of him as quickly as it had come. "What do you mean?" Josie was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still resting on the recipe book. When she spoke, her voice was so soft he had to lean forward to hear her. "I had a daughter once, Emma. She would have been 23 this year if she'd lived." She looked up then, and Colton saw a pain in her eyes that matched his own. "She loved to bake. Always experimenting, always trying to improve on my recipes. I kept her recipe book for years, after she was gone." "What happened to it?" Colton found himself asking, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Lost in a fire along with everything else." Josie's smile was bitter and brief. "Sometimes life takes everything at once, doesn't it? Not just the person, but all the little pieces of them you thought you could hold on to." Colton sank into the chair across from her, the fight gone out of him completely. "How did she die?" "Fever. Winter of '68. She was working as a school teacher in a little town outside San Antonio." Josie's hands were steady on the table, but Colton could see the effort it took to keep them that way. "I was supposed to visit her for Christmas, but the weather turned bad, and I couldn't make the journey. By the time I got there, she'd been in the ground for 2 weeks." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the clock on the mantel and the distant sound of wind through the eaves. Colton stared at the recipe book, seeing it differently now, not just as Sarah's legacy, but as something precious and fragile, the kind of thing that could be lost in an instant. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "So am I." Josie's voice was gentle again, the understanding tone that had made him hire her in the first place. "That's why I know how important this book is to you, how important she is to you." Colton opened the book to a random page, his eyes falling on Sarah's recipe for Sunday chicken, complete with a note about how he liked extra sage in the stuffing. The familiar handwriting blurred for a moment, and he blinked hard to clear his vision. "She died of pneumonia," he heard himself say, "last winter. Started as a cold, but it got into her lungs and just—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence he'd completed 100 times for well-meaning neighbors and concerned friends. "You were with her?" "At the end, yes. Doc Henderson did everything he could, but the fever wouldn't break." Colton traced the edge of the page with his finger, remembering Sarah's hand, doing the same thing as she'd planned their meals for the week. "She made me promise to take care of myself, to eat properly and not let the ranch fall apart." He looked up at Josie with something that might have been a smile. "She would have liked you using her recipes." "Are you sure?" Josie's voice was careful, as if she were testing the weight of thin ice. Colton considered the question seriously. Sarah had been generous with everything she had, always the first to share a recipe with a neighbor or help a friend learn a new technique. She'd kept the recipe book not as a treasure to be hoarded, but as a tool to be used, to bring comfort and nourishment to the people she cared about. "She would have insisted on it," he said finally. "Sarah never could stand to see anyone go hungry, especially not when she had the means to help." Josie nodded, her relief evident. "Thank you for trusting me with them. There's something else." Colton turned a few pages until he found what he was looking for. Sarah's notes about preserving peaches, written in her most careful script. "She was planning to teach you this recipe anyway, if you'd lived here long enough to see summer." "How do you know?" "Because she taught every woman who worked here how to make preserves. Said it was a skill every ranch wife should have." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and both of them froze at the implication. Josie's cheeks colored slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I'd be honored to learn it when the time comes." The moments stretched between them, charged with possibility and fraught with danger. Colton found himself looking at Josie differently, seeing not just the hired help, but a woman who understood loss and resilience, who could be trusted with the things that mattered most. The realization terrified him. "We should get back to work," he said, standing abruptly and nearly knocking over his forgotten coffee cup. "Of course." Josie rose as well, but she didn't move toward the door immediately. Instead, she placed her hand flat on the recipe book one more time. "Colton?" "Yes?" "She's still with you, you know. In the things she taught you, in the way you care for this place, in the kind of man you are." Josie's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was firm. "Loving someone new doesn't erase the love that came before. It just means your heart was worth the trouble of healing." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone in the kitchen with Sarah's recipes and the echo of words that would haunt him for the rest of the day. Colton sat back down heavily, opening the book to the first page where Sarah had written in her careful script, "For the love of my life and all the meals we'll share together." For the first time since her death, reading those words didn't feel like a knife to the chest. Instead, they felt like a benediction, a permission he'd been too afraid to ask for and too proud to accept. As he heard Josie moving around outside, checking on the chickens and talking to them in the same gentle voice she'd used with him, Colton began to understand that Sarah's greatest gift to him might not have been her love, but her wisdom about what love could become. The recipe book remained open on the table for the rest of the day, its pages catching the light that streamed through the windows. Sarah had insisted on enlarging to let in more sunshine. And for the first time in months, the kitchen felt like the heart of a home rather than a monument to what had been lost. The broken fence post stood at an awkward angle where the north pasture met the creek, a testament to the spring flood that had weakened its foundation. Colton had been meaning to fix it for weeks, but somehow there was always something more pressing, demanding his attention. Now, with Josie working beside him to dig out the rotted wood, he wondered why he'd put off the job for so long. "Hand me that level," Josie said, her voice slightly breathless from the effort of holding the new post steady while he packed earth around its base. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of cloth torn from an old shirt, and dirt streaked her forehead where she'd wiped away sweat with the back of her hand. Colton passed her the tool, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. 3 days had passed since the incident with Sarah's recipe book, and the air between them had shifted in ways he was still trying to understand. The careful distance he'd maintained was proving harder to preserve when they worked side by side, when her competence and quiet strength reminded him how much easier every task became with a true partner. "That's good," Josie said, checking the post's alignment. "Now we just need to stretch the wire, and this section will hold for another 10 years. They worked in comfortable silence, moving with the synchronized efficiency of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. Josie anticipated his needs almost before he recognized them himself, passing him tools and materials with the kind of seamless cooperation that usually took months to develop. It should have felt natural, but instead it made Colton acutely aware of how long he'd been working alone, making every decision without consultation, carrying every burden without help. "You've done this before," he observed as she expertly spliced the new wire into the existing fence line. "My husband taught me." The words came out easily, but Colton caught the slight hesitation before she spoke them. He said a ranch wife should know every job on the property in case something happened to him. Smart man. He was. Josie tested the tension in the wire, nodding with satisfaction when it held firm. Thomas believed in being prepared for whatever life might bring. He just never prepared for consumption taking him at 34. Colton had wondered about her husband, but hadn't asked, understanding that some stories came in their own time. "How long were you married?" 12 years. We had the ranch in Texas, about 200 head of cattle, and dreams of building something that would last. Josie began gathering the tools they'd used, her movements efficient, but not hurried. After he died, I tried to keep it going, but between the debts and the drought, I lost everything within 2 years. "Is that when you lost your daughter?" "Emma died 3 years before Thomas. The consumption took her too." Josie's voice remained steady, but Colton saw her hands still for a moment before she resumed packing the tools. "Thomas never got over losing her. I think his grief made him more susceptible to the sickness when it came." The picture she painted was devastating: a woman who'd lost her child, then her husband, then her home and livelihood in the space of 5 years. Yet here she was, working with capable hands and clear eyes, building something new from the wreckage of her old life. The resilience required for such survival humbled him. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "Life has a way of testing our limits," Josie replied philosophically. "The question is whether we let it break us or teach us how strong we really are." They walked back toward the house as the sun began its descent toward the western hills, their tools clanking softly in the gathering dusk. The repaired fence stood straight and strong behind them, a small victory against the entropy that constantly threatened to reclaim the wilderness from civilization. "Josie?" Colton found himself speaking before he'd fully formed the thought. "That first day, when you showed up here, why this place? Why my advertisement?" She was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than evasive. "I'd been traveling for months, taking work where I could find it. Ranch hand in Colorado, cook for a logging camp in Wyoming. I was getting tired, I suppose. Tired of moving. Tired of starting over in places where I knew I'd never belong." "And you thought you might belong here?" Josie stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression serious in the fading light. "When I read your advertisement, something about it felt different. Not just the work you were offering, but the way you wrote it, like you understood what it meant to need something more than just employment." Colton tried to remember exactly what he'd written in that hastily composed notice. "I wasn't thinking that clearly when I placed it. I just knew I needed help and couldn't afford to be particular about who answered. You wrote, 'Seeking reliable person for ranch work, must be self-sufficient and comfortable with solitude. References less important than character.'" Josie's recitation was word, perfect, as if she'd memorized the text. Most advertisements focus on experience and references. Yours talked about character and understanding solitude. It sounded like it was written by someone who knew what it meant to be alone. The observation unsettled him because it was true. He had been thinking about solitude when he'd written those words, about the particular kind of loneliness that came from being surrounded by empty spaces and unshared silence. That Josie had recognized it, had responded to it, suggested a deeper understanding between them than he'd been prepared to acknowledge. "And now that you're here," he asked, "do you still think you might belong?" Josie resumed walking, but her pace was slower now, more contemplative. "I think I'm beginning to understand why you needed someone who was comfortable with solitude. This place demands it all, this space, all this silence, but it also offers something in return." "What's that?" "Peace. The kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be." She looked out across the darkening landscape, where the first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening sky. "I haven't felt that in a very long time." They reached the house as full darkness settled over the ranch, the windows glowing warmly in the night. The scene looked almost domestic from this perspectiva, home where people lived and worked and found contentment in simple routines. Colton tried to see it through Josie's eyes, to understand what had drawn her to this particular place among all the others where she might have stopped. "There's something else," Josie said as they paused on the porch. "That first day, when you hired me, you didn't ask about my references or my past. You just looked at me and decided I could do the work. I could tell you knew what you were about." "Maybe, but I think it was more than that." Josie turned to face him, her expression earnest in the lamplight spilling from the windows. "I think you understood what I was really asking for when I said I needed honest work and a place to sleep. You knew I wasn't just looking for employment." Colton considered her words, recognizing their truth. He had seen something in her that first day, a quality of determined dignity that spoke of someone who'd been knocked down but refused to stay down. It had resonated with something in his own experience, though at the time he hadn't been ready to examine what that might mean. "What were you looking for?" he asked. "A chance to be useful again, to matter to someone's daily life in ways that went beyond just earning wages." Josie's smile was soft and a little sad. To remember what it felt like to be part of something worth building. The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made Colton's chest tight. He understood exactly what she meant, because he'd been looking for the same thing without realizing it, not just help with the ranch work, but a reason to care about the ranch at all. "Well," he said finally, his voice gruff with unexamined emotion, "you've certainly made yourself useful." Josie laughed, a sound that seemed to lighten the weight of everything they'd shared. "That's about the finest compliment a woman like me could ask for." As she headed toward her cabin and he climbed the steps to the main house, Colton found himself looking forward to tomorrow's work in ways he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Not just because the tasks would be easier with help, but because they would be shared with someone who understood the value of building something worth preserving. The thought should have worried him more than it did. The music box sat on Josie's kitchen table like a forgotten treasure, its tarnished silver surface catching the lamplight as she wound the tiny key with trembling fingers. The melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, a lullaby Colton didn't recognize, but that seemed to carry the weight of profound loss in every delicate note. He'd come to her cabin to discuss the next day's work, but the sight of her bent over the small object, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, had stopped him in his tracks. Through the open window, he could hear her whispered words. "Happy birthday, my sweet girl. Mama misses you every day." Colton stood frozen on the threshold, uncertain whether to retreat or announce his presence. The decision was made for him when Josie looked up and saw him there, her eyes red with grief but unashamed of her tears. "I'm sorry," she said, quickly wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I didn't know you were there." "Don't apologize." Colton stepped inside, drawn by an instinct he didn't fully understand. "That's a beautiful piece." Josie's fingers traced the intricate engravings on the music box's lidroses and vines, carved with exquisite detail. "It was Emma's. I gave it to her for her 16th birthday, the last birthday we celebrated together. She wound the key again, and the lullaby resumed its melancholy dance. Today would have been her 24th. The cabin felt suddenly too small for the enormity of her grief, but Colton found himself moving closer rather than retreating. What was she like? Bright, curious about everything. Josie's smile was watery but genuine. She could never sit still long enough to learn proper needlework, but she could read anything you put in front of her. Shakespeare, medical texts, agricultural journals, it didn't matter. She just loved words and ideas. Is that why she became a teacher? She said she wanted to give other children what books had given her, the ability to imagine themselves beyond whatever circumstances they were born into. Josie closed the music box gently, the silence that followed more profound than the melody had been. She was going to change the world, one classroom at a time. Colton settled into the chair across from her, the same instinct that had drawn him inside, now keeping him there, despite the intimacy of the moment. Tell me about her. The request seemed to surprise Josie, but after a moment she began to speak, her voice growing stronger as she shared memories that had been locked away for too long. She told him about Emma's laugh, which had been too loud for polite society, but infectious enough to fill any room with joy. About her stubborn streak, inherited honestly from her mother, and her tender heart that couldn't bear to see any creature suffer. She used to bring home injured animals, Josie said, her eyes growing distant with remembrance. Birds with broken wings, half-drowned kittens, once even a wolf pup she found abandoned in the woods. Thomas would grumble about the expense and the trouble, but he always helped her care for them. Did she save them? Most of them. Emma had a gift for healing gentle hands and infinite patience. I used to think she might become a doctor if women were allowed such things. Josie's voice caught slightly. She would have been magnificent at it. The conversation continued well into the evening, flowing between grief and celebration, between the daughter Josie had lost and the life Emma might have lived. Colton found himself sharing his own memories of Sarah, stories he hadn't told anyone since her death. The way she'd sung while she worked, always slightly off-key but with such enthusiasm that he'd never had the heart to correct her. Her terrible sense of direction that had gotten them lost on their own property more than once. The way she'd always saved the best piece of anything for him, claiming she preferred the smaller portion. She sounds like she was very generous, Josie observed. To a fault. Sometimes I worried she'd give away everything we had if someone needed it more. Colton smiled at the memory. She probably would have invited you to live in the main house instead of the cabin. Would have insisted on it, actually. And how would you have felt about that? The question caught him off guard, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wasn't sure he was ready to voice it. 3 weeks ago, the thought of anyone living in Sarah's house, sleeping in Sarah's rooms, would have felt like sacrilege. Now, watching Josie's kind eyes in the lamplight, he found the idea less disturbing than it should have been. I think I might have gotten used to it, he admitted quietly. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of possibilities neither had been willing to name before this moment. Josie looked down at the music box, her fingers tracing its edges with unconscious tenderness. Sometimes I dream about her, she said softly. Emma, in the dreams, she's still teaching, still saving the world one student at a time. When I wake up for just a moment, I forget she's gone. The remembering is always the hardest part. I know. Colton's voice was rough, with his own remembered pain. Sarah comes to me in dreams too. We're always doing ordinary things, making breakfast, mending fences, planning for the future we thought we'd have. The dreams are beautiful and terrible at the same time. Do you think they'd want us to stop dreaming about them? No. The answer came without hesitation. I think they'd want us to carry the best parts of them forward. The love, the laughter, the way they made us better than we were alone. Josie nodded, understanding passing between them, without need for further words. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of shared grief somehow lighter for being shared at all. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch created a gentle symphony, cattle lowing in the distance, the soft whicker of horses in the barn, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods by the creek. "Colton?" Josie's voice was hesitant, as if she were testing the shape of his name on her tongue. "Yes? Thank you for listening, for not trying to tell me it gets easier, or that time heals all wounds." She looked up at him with eyes that held a new warmth. "For understanding that some losses are too deep to ever completely heal, but that doesn't mean we can't learn to live with them. Thank you for trusting me with her memory." Josie reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, the contact electric in its simplicity. "I think Emma would have liked you. She always had good instincts about people. I would have liked to meet her. She would have pestered you with questions about being a marshal, probably tried to convince you to let her ride along on patrol." Josie's laugh was soft and genuine. She never could resist an adventure. As Colton walked back to the main house under a canopy of stars, he carried with him the echo of that laughter and the image of Josie's face as she'd shared her most precious memories. The grief she carried was profound, but so was her capacity for joy, for hope, for the kind of love that persisted beyond death itself. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, he fell asleep without the weight of guilty loneliness pressing against his chest. Instead, he dreamed of laughter filling empty rooms, and the possibility that hearts broken by loss might still have room for unexpected blessings. The storm lantern cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls as wind howled through the canyon like a living thing, driving snow horizontal against the windows with a fury that spoke of winter's early arrival. Colton had seen storms before, but this one carried the weight of real danger, the kind that could bury the ranch under 3 feet of snow and cut them off from town for weeks. "The horses are secure," he said, shaking ice crystals from his coat as he stepped inside Josie's cabin. His own house sat 50 yards away, but the distance might as well have been 50 miles in weather like this. "But we're going to lose some calves if this keeps up through the night." Josie looked up from the fire she'd been tending, her face grave in the flickering light. "How long do you think it will last?" "Could be hours, could be days. Hard to tell with these early storms." Colton moved closer to the fire, grateful for the warmth that seeped through his frozen clothes. "Mind if I stay here tonight? I don't fancy trying to make it back to the house in this." "Of course." Josie's response came without hesitation, though he caught the slight flush that colored her cheeks. "I'll make some coffee, and there's stew left from dinner." The cabin felt smaller with both of them in it, but not uncomfortably so. Over the past month, they'd developed an easy rhythm of shared meals and conversation, but being trapped together by the storm created an intimacy that was both thrilling and terrifying. As the wind continued its assault on the little building, Colton found himself acutely aware of Josie's presence, the way she moved around the small space with quiet efficiency, the way her hair caught the firelight when she bent to stir the stew. "This reminds me of a storm Thomas and I weathered our first winter on the ranch," Josie said, settling into the chair across from him with a steaming bowl. "We were so poor we couldn't afford proper shutters, and the wind kept blowing snow right through the gaps in the walls. We spent 3 days huddled around the fire, taking turns feeding wood to keep it going. Sounds miserable. It should have been." Josie's smile was soft with memory, "but we were so young and so in love that it felt like an adventure. We told stories, played cards, planned all the improvements we'd make to the place come spring." Her expression grew wistful. "I don't think I've ever been happier than I was those 3 days, snowed in with nothing but each other for company." Colton understood the feeling she described, though he'd never experienced it quite that way with Sarah. Their marriage had been built on different foundations, mutual respect, shared goals, a love that grew steadily over time rather than burning bright from the beginning. But sitting here with Josie, listening to the storm rage outside while warmth and light surrounded them, he caught a glimpse of what she meant. "What kind of improvements did you make?" "Oh, everything. Better windows, a proper floor instead of packed dirt, a real stove instead of cooking over the fire." Josie's voice grew animated as she remembered. "Thomas wanted to expand the house, add rooms for the children we planned to have. I wanted a garden with fruit trees and a proper chicken coop. We drew plans on scraps of paper and dreamed about the day we'd have enough money to make it all real." Did any of it happen? Some. We managed the windows and the floor, even got that stove I wanted so badly. But the children never came. Emma was all we had, and then Thomas got sick, and the dreams just... She stopped, her voice catching slightly. Well, dreams are just dreams until you have the means to make them real. Not all of them. Colton leaned forward, caught by an impulse he didn't fully understand. You're here now, building something new, that has to count for something. Josie looked at him with surprise, as if the thought hadn't occurred to her. I suppose it does, though I'm not sure what I'm building here. A life worth living, a place where you matter. The words came out more earnestly than he'd intended, but he didn't try to take them back. You've made a difference here, Josie. To the ranch, too, he stopped himself before he could say to me, but the words hung in the air between them anyway. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside their small circle of light and warmth, time seemed suspended. They talked through the night, sharing stories and silences with equal comfort. Josie told him about her childhood in Louisiana, about parents who'd died when she was barely 16, and the uncle who'd taken her in until she married Thomas. Colton found himself talking about his father, a stern man who'd believed in hard work and harder discipline, and his mother, who'd died when he was 12 and left him to navigate adolescence without her gentle guidance. Is that why you became a marshal? Josie asked as the wind finally began to quiet. Following in your father's footsteps? Partly, but mostly because someone had to stand between decent folks and the ones who'd take advantage of them. Colton poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. There's something to be said for work that has clear right and wrong answers. In a world full of grey areas, the law gives you something solid to hold on to. And now, do you still feel that way? The question made him pause, made him examine assumptions he'd held for so long they'd become invisible. I'm not sure. Since Sarah died, everything feels more complicated. The law is still the law, but the reasons I cared about enforcing it, protecting home and family, building something worth defending those reasons, feel less clear now. Maybe that's because you're looking for new reasons. Before he could ask what she meant, a crash from outside sent them both to the window. A large branch had broken from one of the cottonwoods, taking down a section of fence in the process. They stood close together, looking out at the damage, and Colton became acutely aware of Josie's warmth beside him, the scent of lavender soap in her hair. We'll have a lot of work to do when this clears, she said softly. We will. The word we felt natural on his tongue, as if he'd been saying it for years instead of weeks. But we'll manage it, together. Josie turned to look at him, and for a moment, the space between them seemed to crackle with more electricity than the storm outside. Her lips were slightly parted, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope or fear or both. Colton found himself leaning closer, drawn by an attraction he'd been fighting since the day she'd arrived. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and fraught with the weight of everything they'd shared. Just as his hand moved to touch her face, a violent gust of wind rattled the entire cabin, reminding them both of the storm still raging outside and the fragile nature of the shelter they'd found in each other's company. Josie stepped back, her cheeks flushed, but her voice steady. I should check the fire. Of course. Colton cleared his throat, embarrassed by how close he'd come to crossing a line he wasn't sure either of them was ready for. I'll see if the coffee needs warming. They busied themselves with small tasks, the awkwardness of the moment gradually giving way to their usual comfortable rhythm. But something had changed between them, a recognition that the feelings growing in the quiet spaces of their shared work had depths neither had been willing to acknowledge. As dawn finally broke grey and cold over the snow-covered ranch, Colton helped Josie bank the fire and prepare for the long day of storm cleanup ahead. The crisis had passed, but the memory of those hours trapped together, of conversations that had revealed more than either had intended, would linger long after the snow melted and spring returned to Black Mesa. The bundle of letters sat on Colton's desk like an accusation, tied with a faded blue ribbon that Sarah had chosen because it matched her eyes. Josie stood in the doorway of his study, her face pale with mortification, clutching a dust cloth in hands that trembled slightly. "I'm so sorry," she said for the third time since he'd found her there, staring at the letters she'd accidentally knocked to the floor while cleaning. "I was just dusting the shelves, and when I moved the books, they fell out. I didn't mean to see." "It's all right." Colton's voice was rougher than he'd intended, scraped raw by emotions he'd thought were safely buried. "You couldn't have known they were there." But that wasn't entirely true. The letters had been hidden deliberately, tucked between volumes of agricultural journals where no casual observer would think to look. They were his secret shame, evidence of thoughts and feelings he'd never been brave enough to share while Sarah was alive. "The handwriting is beautiful," Josie said quietly, her eyes fixed on the bundle rather than his face. "She must have been very special to inspire such devotion." "You read them?" The question came out sharper than he'd meant it to, and he saw Josie flinch. "Only the first few lines of the one on top. I stopped as soon as I realized what they were." She looked up at him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But those few lines were enough to see how much you loved her." Colton picked up the letters, his fingers automatically finding the familiar weight and texture of the paper. There were dozens of them, written over the course of their 12-year marriage, but never sent, never shared. Love letters to a woman who'd lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, shared his daily life, but somehow never knew the full depth of what she meant to him. "I started writing them after our first anniversary," he said, surprised to hear himself speaking. "Sarah was always so practical, so focused on the daily necessities of keeping the ranch running. She wasn't given to romantic gestures or flowery words. I thought if I wrote down how I felt, maybe someday I'd find the courage to tell her." "Why didn't you?" The question hung between them, simple and devastating. Colton had asked himself the same thing 1,000 times since Sarah's death, tormented by the knowledge that she'd died, without ever knowing the poetry he'd found in her everyday grace. Fear, I suppose. Fear that she'd think I was foolish, or that the words would somehow cheapen what we had. He untied the ribbon with careful fingers, revealing the top letterone he'd written just weeks before she'd gotten sick. Sarah was so practical, so grounded. I worried that telling her I saw starlight in her smile or found music in her laughter would make her think I'd lost my mind. Josie moved closer, drawn by something in his voice. Would you mind if I heard one, just to understand what kind of man you really are?" The request should have felt intrusive, but coming from Josie, it felt like an invitation to finally share the burden he'd been carrying alone. Colton selected a letter from the middle of the stack, one written during their 5th year of marriage, when contentment had settled over their life like a comfortable blanket. "My dearest Sarah," he read, his voice barely above a whisper, "today I watched you hanging clothes on the line, and the wind caught your skirt and made it dance around your ankles. You were humming that song you love, the one about the mockingbird, and for a moment you looked exactly like the girl I married. But then you turned and smiled at me, and I saw the woman you've become, the one who makes our house a home and our land a paradise. I wanted to run to you and tell you that every sunrise is more beautiful because you're there to share it, but instead I just waved and went back to mending the fence. Someday I'll find the words to tell you what you mean to me. Until then, I'll keep writing them down and hoping you can see the love in my eyes, even when my tongue fails me." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the tick of the mantel clock and the distant sound of cattle in the pasture. When Colton looked up, he saw tears streaming down Josie's face, but her expression was soft with wonder rather than sorrow. "Oh, Colton," she breathed. "These are beautiful. They're love made tangible, poetry written in the language of the heart. They're just words I was too cowardly to speak." "No." Josie's voice was firm, almost fierce. "They're proof that you loved her with a depth most people never experience. The fact that you wrote them, that you preserved them, that you still carry the guilt of not sharing them, that tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are." Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully, and what he saw in her eyes made his breath catch. There was understanding there, and compassion, but also something deeper, a warmth that seemed to encompass not just sympathy for his loss, but appreciation for his capacity to love so completely. "You think I'm a fool," he said, but it was more question than statement. "I think you're a man who loves so deeply it frightens you. I think you're someone who sees beauty in ordinary moments and finds poetry in everyday life." Josie took a step closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "I think Sarah was lucky to be loved by someone like you, whether she knew the full extent of it or not. And I think I'm a man who's been carrying regret like a stone in his chest for months, wishing I could go back and be braver." "You can't go back," Josie said gently, "but you can choose to be braver now." The words hung between them, laden with meaning that went far beyond the discussion of old letters. Colton found himself looking at Josie really, looking at Herond, seeing not just the woman who'd helped him heal from grief, but someone who understood the language of deep feeling, who wouldn't mock the poetry he found in simple moments. "Josie," he said, her name feeling different on his tongue than it ever had before. "Yes?" Instead of answering with words, he reached for her hand, threading their fingers together with a tenderness that spoke of new beginnings rather than desperate need. She didn't pull away, and when he used his free hand to touch her face, she leaned into the contact, as if she'd been waiting for it. "I don't want to make the same mistake twice," he said softly. "I don't want to love someone and leave them guessing about it." "You won't," Josie whispered, and then she was rising on her toes to meet him as he bent to kiss her. The kiss was gentle, tentative, full of question marks and careful hope. It tasted of coffee and possibility, of two people who'd found each other in the aftermath of loss and discovered that broken hearts could still hold room for unexpected blessing. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, both trembling with the magnitude of what had just shifted between them. "I care about you," Colton said, the words feeling both inadequate and profound. "More than I expected to care about anyone again." "I know." Josie's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. "I care about you too, enough to be terrified of what it might mean. We don't have to figure it all out tonight." "No, but we can't pretend it isn't happening either." Colton looked down at the letters scattered on his desk, then back at the woman in his arms. For the first time since Sarah's death, the future felt like something more than just an endless succession of empty days. It felt like a story waiting to be written, one where love didn't always end in loss, where second chances could bloom even in the hardest soil. "No," he agreed, pulling her closer, "we can't pretend anymore." The wanted poster was weathered and faded, but Josie's face stared back from the yellowed paper with unmistakable clarity. The stranger who'd ridden into Cedar Falls that morning had been asking questions, casual inquiries about new residents, particular interest in women traveling alone. Sheriff Martinez had thought it prudent to ride out and warn Colton, not knowing he was about to shatter the fragile happiness that had been growing at Black Mesa Ranch. "When did this come in?" Colton asked, his voice carefully controlled as he studied the poster. The charges were serious theft of cattle, conspiracy to defraud, accessory to murder. The reward was substantial enough to attract every bounty hunter west of the Mississippi. 2 days ago, the man asking questions claims to be a federal marshal, but he's not wearing a badge, and his credentials looked questionable. Martinez shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "I thought you should know, given your arrangement with Miss Mayfield." Colton's eyes found the date on the poster issued 18 months ago from San Antonio, Texas, right around the time Josie had said she'd lost her ranch and begun traveling. The coincidence felt like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and leaving him reeling. "Have you talked to her about this?" "Figured that was your call, being as she works for you." Martinez's expression was carefully neutral, but Colton could read the concern in his old friend's eyes. "Colton, if she's wanted for murder, she's not a killer." The words came out fierce and certain, surprising them both with their vehemence. "Whatever this is about, there's more to the story." "Maybe so, but that poster is legal, and if that man is who he claims to be, we've got an obligation to uphold the law." The law. Colton had built his life around those words, had worn his badge with pride for 15 years. Justice, order, the protection of innocent people from those who would harm them. These had been his guiding principles. Now they felt like chains, binding him to a duty that would destroy the woman he'd come to love. "Give me time to talk to her," Colton said finally. "Let me hear her side before we do anything irreversible." Martinez nodded reluctantly. 24 hours. After that, if that federal man comes back with proper credentials, I'll have to act. Colton watched his friend ride back toward town, the wanted poster burning like acid in his coat pocket. The sun was setting behind the mesa, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that should have been beautiful but now felt ominous. Everything he'd begun to believe about Josie, everything they'd shared and built together, suddenly seemed fragile as spun glass. He found her in the garden behind the house, harvesting the last of the winter squash before the hard freeze that was forecast for the week. She looked up at his approach, her smile faltering when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, straightening slowly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have." Colton pulled the poster from his pocket, watching her face as recognition dawned. The color drained from her cheeks, but she didn't deny what they both could see clearly enough. "Where did you get that?" "Sheriff Martinez brought it. There's a man in town asking questions about you." Colton's voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he held the paper. "Is it true? Are you wanted for murder?" Josie closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, they held a resignation that spoke of secrets finally coming to light. "It's complicated." "Then uncomplicated for me." She moved to the garden bench Sarah had built, settling onto it with the careful movements of someone suddenly feeling every one of her years. "The charges are real. The warrant is legitimate. But I didn't kill anyone, Colton. I swear to you on my daughter's grave, I never took a life." "Then why is your name on a murder warrant?" "Because I was there when it happened. Because I ran instead of staying to explain. Because sometimes being innocent isn't enough to keep you safe from the law." Josie's voice was flat, emotionless, as if she were reciting facts about someone else's life. "Have you ever heard of James Vernon?" Colton nodded grimly. Vernon was a name that appeared in wanted posters across 3 territories, a cattle rustler and confidence man, who specialized in bilking widows out of their property. He's been operating in Texas and Colorado for years. He came to our ranch 6 months after Thomas died. I was struggling to keep the place going, behind on payments to the bank, desperate enough to listen when he offered to help. Josie's laugh was bitter and brief. "He said he could arrange buyers for my cattle, get better prices than I could manage on my own. All I had to do was sign some papers transferring temporary ownership to his company." "You gave him your cattle?" "I gave him what I thought was a legal contract for representation. What I actually gave him was a bill of sale for stolen livestock." Josie stared out at the darkening landscape, her voice growing quieter. "The cattle he was selling weren't just mine. He'd been rustling stock all over the county, mixing stolen animals with legitimate sales to hide the theft. When the law finally caught up with him, my cattle were part of a herd he was driving to market in New Mexico. But surely you could prove you were deceived." "With what?" "The papers I'd signed gave him legal ownership of my animals. My word against his meant nothing, especially when he had 2 men willing to swear I was his partner from the beginning." Josie's hands twisted in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. "The murder happened the night they arrested him. Vernon tried to escape, and in the fight, a deputy was killed. One of Vernon's men claimed I'd told them to run, that I was part of the plan. Were you there?" "I was in town trying to get my cattle back when it happened. When I heard the shots, I ran to see what was wrong. By the time I got there, the deputy was dead, and Vernon was bleeding out in the street." Josie's voice cracked slightly. He looked at me and said, "Tell them she was in on it from the start. Tell them it was her idea." And then he died. "Why didn't you stay and fight the charges?" "Because I was a widow, with no money and no influence, and there were 2 witnesses willing to swear I was guilty." Josie finally looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Because I'd seen what frontier justice looked like when people wanted someone to blame. because I was terrified they'd hang me for something I didn't do. Colton absorbed this, trying to reconcile the woman he'd come to know with the picture painted by the charges. Josie had never struck him as someone given to poor judgment, but grief and desperation could drive good people to make choices they'd never consider under normal circumstances. "So you ran." "I ran. Took what little money I had left and disappeared. I've been moving ever since, taking work where I could find it, always looking over my shoulder." Josie's voice was barely above a whisper now. "I thought I'd finally found a place where the past couldn't reach me." The man asking questions, "Do you know who he is?" "Probably a bounty hunter. The reward on that poster is enough to make it worth the trouble of tracking me down." Josie stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. "I should go. Tonight, before he finds me here, I won't bring this trouble to your door." "No." The word came out sharper than Colton had intended, surprising them both. "You're not running again." "Colton, you don't understand. If they find me here, if they connect you to me, it could destroy everything you've built, your reputation, your position as Marshal. I don't care about any of that. You should. You have a life here, responsibilities. I'm just a woman with nowhere else to go." "You're not just anything." Colton moved to her, taking her hands in his, despite the way she tried to pull away. "You're the woman I love, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take you away from me without a fight." The admission hung between them, raw and honest in the gathering darkness. It was the first time either of them had used the word love, and the weight of it settled over them both like a benediction and a curse. "You can't love me," Josie whispered, "not knowing what you know now." "I can and I do. Whatever happened in Texas, whatever mistakes you made, they don't change who you are here and now." Colton cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "But I need you to tell me the truth, all of it. If we're going to fight this, I need to know everything." Josie searched his face, looking for signs of doubt or judgment. When she found only steadfast determination and a love that seemed strong enough to weather any storm, she began to speak. The whole story poured out of her the desperation that had driven her to trust a stranger, the horror of realizing she'd been used, the terror of running from charges she couldn't disprove. She told him about the months of hiding, the false names, the constant fear that had become her closest companion. By the time she finished, full darkness had settled over the ranch, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the clear desert sky. Colton listened without interruption, his hands never leaving hers, his eyes never wavering from her face. "Do you believe me?" she asked finally. "Every word." Colton's voice was firm, certain. "And tomorrow we're going to start proving your innocence." "How?" "It's been 18 months. The witnesses against me are probably long gone. And even if we could find them, we'll find a way. There's always evidence if you know where to look for it." Colton pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if he could shield her from the world, through will alone. "I didn't find you just to lose you to a lie. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we're going to clear your name." For the first time since she'd seen the wanted poster, Josie allowed herself to hope. In Colton's arms, surrounded by his fierce protectiveness and unwavering faith, the future didn't seem quite as hopeless as it had an hour before. But even as she clung to him, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Colton's Marshal badge caught the lamplight as he turned it over in his hands, its familiar weight now feeling like the heaviest burden he'd ever carried. The badge represented 15 years of service, of choosing duty over comfort, law over convenience. Now it forced him to choose between justice and love, between the oath he'd sworn and the woman who'd become his reason for living. Dawn was still 3 hours away, but sleep had become impossible. Josie sat across from him at the kitchen table, her face pale but resolute in the flickering candlelight. They'd spent the night planning, considering options, preparing for a fight that might cost them everything they'd found together. "You don't have to do this," Josie said quietly, watching him study the badge. "You could turn me in, let the law take its course. No one would blame you for choosing duty over a woman you've known for only 2 months." "Stop." Colton's voice was firm but gentle. "We've been through this. I'm not turning you in, and I'm not letting anyone else take you without a fight. Even if it costs you your position, your reputation, some things matter more than reputation. Colton set the badge on the table between them, its polished surface reflecting the candlelight like a star fallen to earth. Besides, what good is a badge if I use it to destroy an innocent woman? The plan they'd developed was risky but thorough. Colton would use his connections in law enforcement to investigate the original case, looking for inconsistencies in the witness's testimony and evidence that might have been overlooked. Meanwhile, Josie would write down everything she could remember about James Vernon and his associates, searching her memory for details that might prove useful. "There's something else," Josie said, her voice hesitant. "Something I didn't tell you last night." Colton looked up sharply. "What?" Vernon wasn't working alone. He had a partner, someone with connections, someone who could forge documents and bribe officials when necessary. Josie's hands twisted in her lap. A gesture he'd learned meant she was fighting painful memories. "I only saw him once, the day I signed those papers." Vernon introduced him as his business partner, said he was the one who arranged the buyers. "Do you remember his name?" "Samuel Crane. He was well-dressed, educated, spoke like a man from back east." Josie's eyes grew distant as she recalled the meeting. What struck me at the time was how nervous Vernon seemed around him, like Crane was the one really in charge. Colton felt a chill run down his spine. Samuel Crane was a name he recognized, though not from wanted posters. Crane was a territorial judge, a man with influence and connections stretching from Texas to Colorado. If he was involved in Vernon's operation, it would explain how the rustling had continued for so long without serious investigation. "Josie," he said carefully, "are you absolutely certain that's who you saw?" "Positive." "Why? Do you know him?" "Judge Samuel Crane sits on the territorial bench in Colorado. He's presided over dozens of rustling cases, sent men to prison for the very crimes Vernon was committing." Colton ran his hands through his hair, the implications of this revelation staggering. If Crane was Vernon's partner, if he was using his position to protect the operation, then my testimony could destroy him? Josie finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. "That's why Vernon implicated me with his dying words. Crane needed someone to take the blame, someone who couldn't fight back. And now that someone has surfaced again, threatening to expose the truth." Colton reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "No wonder that bounty hunter is so determined to find you. Crane probably has every manhunter from here to the Mississippi looking for you." The weight of what they were facing settled over them both. This wasn't just about clearing Josie's name anymore. It was about exposing corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Judge Crane had the power to make evidence disappear, witnesses vanish, and inconvenient questions go unasked. Fighting him would be like challenging the law itself. "We should go to the federal authorities," Josie suggested. "Surely there are honest men in Denver who would listen." "Maybe, but Crane has friends there too, and without proof, it's your word against a respected judge's." Colton stood and began pacing, his mind racing through possibilities. "We need evidence, something concrete that ties Crane to the rustling operation. The bills of sale Vernon used, they would have required a judge's seal to be legitimate. If we could prove Crane provided forged documents, those papers are probably long gone, destroyed as soon as the operation fell apart." Colton stopped pacing, struck by a new thought. But Crane couldn't have been the only one involved. An operation that size, spanning multiple territories, would have required accomplices. Other officials, maybe even lawmen. They spent the rest of the night developing their strategy. Colton would use his marshal credentials to request files on the original case, looking for patterns and inconsistencies. He'd also reach out to trusted contacts in other territories, men who might have information about similar operations or suspicious judicial decisions. Josie would focus on her memories of Vernon and his associates, trying to recall details that might prove significant. Names, dates, anything that could provide leads to follow. As the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Sheriff Martinez arrived with news that made their hearts sink. The bounty hunter had returned with proper federal credentials and a warrant for Josie's arrest. He was gathering a posse and would be riding out to the ranch within the hour. "I tried to delay him," Martinez said, his weathered face grim with concern. "Told him about some rustler activity to the south that needed investigating first. But he's not buying it. Says he knows she's here, and he's coming to get her." "How long do we have?" Colton asked. "Maybe 2 hours if we're lucky." It wasn't enough time to prove Josie's innocence, but it might be enough to get her somewhere safe while they built their case. Colton made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before he was going to help a wanted fugitive escape justice, at least temporarily. "There's a cabin up in the high country," he said to Josie, "near the old mining claims. It's remote, defensible, and I know the trails well enough to get you there unseen." "Colton, no. If they catch you helping me." "They won't catch us, and even if they do, I'd rather face charges for aiding a fugitive than live with letting an innocent woman hang for crimes she didn't commit." The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Colton gathered supplies, weapons, and documents, while Josie packed only the essentials. She insisted on leaving Sarah's recipe book behind, saying she wouldn't take something so precious into danger. Instead, she took only the small music box that had belonged to her daughter, wrapping it carefully in her spare dress. As they prepared to leave, Colton pinned his marshal's badge to the kitchen table, weighing it down with Sarah's recipe book. If anyone came looking for answers, they'd find his resignation right there in plain sight. "Are you sure about this?" Josie asked one final time as they led their horses from the barn. Colton looked back at the ranch house, at the life he'd built, and was now abandoning for an uncertain future. The bent horseshoe above the door caught the morning light, and for the first time since Sarah had found it, it seemed to promise good luck rather than sorrow. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said, helping her into the saddle. They rode out just as the sun cleared the eastern hills, taking the trail that led up into the rugged country where few men dared to follow. Behind them, dust on the horizon marked the approach of the posse that would find an empty ranch and more questions than answers. The hunt for Josie Mayfield was about to become something far more dangerous than anyone expected, a quest for truth that would shake the foundations of territorial justice and test the limits of love's power to overcome impossible odds. As they climbed into the high country, following paths known only to a few, Colton found himself thinking not about what they'd left behind, but about what lay ahead. Somewhere in the wilderness above, they would make their stand. Together, they would fight for the truth, no matter what it cost them. The badge he'd left behind was just metal and authority. The woman riding beside him was life itself, and he would defend that life with everything he had. The testimony letter arrived 3 days into their mountain exile, carried by Doc Henderson on his old mule through trails that would have challenged a younger man on a better horse. Colton and Josie had been living in the abandoned mining cabin, surviving on jerky and stream water while watching the valley below for signs of pursuit. The letter was folded carefully in the doctor's vest pocket, its edges worn from careful handling. "This came to my office yesterday," Doc Henderson said, his breathing labored from the climb. "Return address says it's from a law office in San Antonio. The lawyer said it was urgent, that I should get it to you as quickly as possible." Colton's hands trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal and unfolded the pages. The letterhead belonged to Morrison and Associates, attorneys at law, but the letter itself was written in a shaky, dying man's hand. "Read it aloud," Josie said softly, moving to stand beside him. Colton cleared his throat and began, "To Marshal Colton Rigg and Miss Josie Mayfield. My name is Frank Morrison. I am a lawyer in San Antonio and a dying man with a guilty conscience. For 18 months I have carried knowledge that could clear Miss Mayfield's name, but fear of powerful men kept me silent. Now, with consumption eating my lungs and perhaps only days left to live, I can no longer bear the weight of this secret. I was present when Judge Samuel Crane met with James Vernon to plan the cattle rustling operation that ultimately led to Deputy Marshal Tucker's death. Crane provided forged documentation and legal protection in exchange for a percentage of the profits. When the operation collapsed and Vernon was cornered, Crane ordered him to implicate Miss Mayfield to protect himself from investigation. I have in my possession documents in Crane's own handwriting that detail the arrangement, including payments made and services rendered. More importantly, I have a signed confession from one of Vernon's dying declaration made just last week by William Hayes, who has been carrying his own guilt these 18 months. Hayes confesses that he and his partner, Robert Chen, gave false testimony against Miss Mayfield at Judge Crane's direction. Both men were promised immunity and payment for their lies. Hayes further states that Miss Mayfield was not present during the planning of any criminal activity and played no role in Deputy Tucker's death. By the time you read this letter, I will likely be dead, but the documents will be in the hands of Federal Marshal Thomas Bradley in Denver. Marshal Bradley has been investigating irregularities in territorial courts and will act on this evidence immediately. Miss Mayfield, I am deeply sorry for the suffering my cowardice has caused you. I pray this confession can restore your freedom and your good name. The letter was signed with a wavering signature and dated just 5 days earlier. He's dead then, Doc Henderson said quietly. Morrison passed yesterday morning, according to the telegram that came with the letter, but he made sure the evidence reached the federal authorities before he died. Josie sank onto the rough wooden bench outside the cabin, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "It's over," she whispered. "After all this time, it's finally over." But Colton was studying the valley below through his field glasses, his expression grim. "Not yet, it isn't. Look." Dust clouds marked the approach of riders, too many riders, moving with too much purpose to be anything other than the posse that had been hunting them. At the head of the group rode a man Colton recognized, even at distance, Samuel Crane himself, no longer content to work through intermediaries. "How did they find us?" Josie asked, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "Doesn't matter now," Colton replied, already moving to check their weapons. "What matters is that Crane is desperate enough to come himself. That means he knows about Morrison's confession, and he's running out of time." Doc Henderson struggled to his feet, understanding the danger, even if he couldn't quite comprehend its scope. "There's another trail out of here, follows the ridge north towards Silverton. Might be you could." "No more running," Colton said firmly. "Morrison gave us the truth, but truth only matters if someone lives to tell it. Crane will kill all of us if he can, make it look like we died resisting arrest." The cabin sat on a natural shelf of rock, protected on 3 sides by steep cliffs, but vulnerable to approach from the south. Colton had chosen it for the defensive advantages, hoping they wouldn't need them. Now those advantages would be put to the test. "How many men?" Josie asked, surprising him with her calm tone. 8, maybe 10, all armed, all willing to follow Crane's orders without asking too many questions. Colton handed her a rifle, checking to make sure she knew how to handle it. "Can you shoot?" "Thomas taught me. I'm not Annie Oakley, but I can hit what I aim at." "Good. Doc, you need to get out of here. Take the north trail and don't look back." "I'm too old to run and too stubborn to abandon friends," Henderson replied with surprising firmness. "Besides, someone needs to witness what happens here. If things go badly, the truth needs to survive, even if we don't." The riders were closer now, close enough to see the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels and the determined set of Crane's shoulders. He was a tall man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. Today, that assumption would be tested. "Rigg," Crane's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "You're harboring a fugitive from justice. Send out Miss Mayfield and we'll discuss terms." "What terms?" Colton called back, positioning himself behind the cabin's stone chimney. "A fair trial, due process, everything she should have had 18 months ago." The lie was so bold it was almost admirable. Crane was offering the very justice he'd denied, knowing that the only trial Josie would face would be a sham designed to silence her permanently. "We know about Morrison's confession," Colton shouted. "The federal marshals in Denver have the evidence. It's over, Crane. The best thing you can do now is surrender and hope they show mercy." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. When Crane spoke again, his voice carried the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Morrison was a sick old man with a guilty conscience. His ravings prove nothing, and the men he claims to have evidence from are already dead. Crane's tone grew harder. "You have 1 minute to send out the woman, or we'll take her by force." "Let them come," Josie said quietly, checking the action on her rifle. "I'm tired of running, tired of living in fear. If this is where it ends, at least it ends with the truth." Colton looked at her, truly looked at Herond, saw not the frightened fugitive who'd arrived at his ranch, but a woman who'd found her courage again. She was prepared to fight for her freedom, prepared to die for it if necessary. The sight filled him with a fierce pride and an equally fierce determination to see her live to enjoy the vindication Morrison's confession would bring. "It won't end here," he promised. "We're going to survive this, and you're going to go home free." "Home?" Josie's smile was soft, despite the circumstances. "I am home, Colton. Wherever you are, that's home for me now." The words hit him like a physical blow, sweet and painful at the same time. He'd found love again, found a reason to believe in the future, and now he had to fight to keep it from being torn away by a corrupt judge's desperation. "Time's up, Rigg." Crane's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "You've made your choice." The first shot rang out before the echo of Crane's words had faded, splitting the mountain silence like thunder and beginning a battle that would determine whether justice or corruption would prevail in the high country above Black Mesa. The new wedding ring caught the lamplight as Colton turned it over in his palm, its simple gold band unmarked by any history except the hope it represented. 3 days had passed since the gunfight at the mining cabin. 3 days since Federal Marshal Bradley had arrived with a full company of cavalry to arrest Judge Crane and the remnants of his posse. Now, in the quiet of his kitchen, Colton was preparing to ask the most important question of his life. Josie stood at the stove, preparing their evening meal as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't spent the morning giving testimony that would send a corrupt judge to federal prison for the rest of his life. Her name had been cleared, the charges dropped, and the territorial governor had issued a formal apology for the injustice she'd suffered. She was free to go anywhere, do anything, start fresh wherever she chose. The thought terrified him. "You're nervous," Josie observed without turning around, her tone gently amused. "I can hear you fidgeting from here." "How do you know I'm nervous?" "Because you've been carrying that ring around for 2 days. And every time you think I'm not looking, you take it out and stare at it like it might disappear." She turned then, her eyes bright with mischief and something deeper. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Colton felt his cheeks redden, caught between embarrassment and relief. "I was trying to find the right moment." "The right moment for what?" He stood then, the ring clutched in his palm, and looked at this woman who'd transformed his life in ways he was still discovering. The fear and uncertainty of the past few days had burned away everything non-essential, leaving only the core truth that mattered. He loved her, and he wanted to spend whatever years remained to him proving it every single day. "Josie Mayfield," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I need to ask you something." "I'm listening." "You're free now, free to go anywhere, be anything, start over in places where no one knows your name or your story." Colton took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "But before you decide what comes next, I need you to know that these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. Not just since Sarah died, but ever." "Colton, let me finish." He moved closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to smell the lavender soap she used in her hair. "I know I'm not much of a prize. I'm a broken-down marshal with a ranch that barely pays for itself and more emotional baggage than any reasonable woman should have to carry. But I love you, Josie. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you make ordinary moments feel like gifts." "You're not broken down," she said softly. "You're the finest man I've ever known." "Then marry me. The words came out in a rush, propelled by months of buried hope and the desperate need to speak them before courage failed him. "Stay here with me. Help me build something worth leaving behind. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." Josie's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling through them in a way that made his heart race with hope. "Are you asking me to be your wife?" "I'm begging you to be my wife." Colton dropped to one knee right there in the kitchen, opening his palm to reveal the ring he'd purchased during their first trip back to town after the charges were dropped. "I know it's not much, and I know you deserve better than a rancher's simple life, but—" "Yes." The words stopped him mid-sentence, simple and complete, and more beautiful than any poetry he'd ever attempted to write. "Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll stay here and help you build something beautiful. Yes, to all of it, Colton Rig." Josie knelt beside him, taking his face in her hands. "Did you really think I'd say anything else?" He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, marveling at how perfectly it fit, how right it looked there. "I hoped, but hope and certainty are different things." "Then let me give you certainty." Josie's voice was fierce with emotion, steady with conviction. "I love you. I choose you. I choose this life with you, whatever it brings." When he kissed her then, it tasted of salt tears and sweet promise, of two hearts that had found their way to each other through grief and fear, and the kind of love that grew stronger in adversity. Around them, the kitchen that had once felt empty now hummed with the energy of a home, about to be shared by two people who understood the value of second chances. "When?" he asked, when they finally broke apart. "Soon. Tomorrow if we can manage it." Josie laughed, the sound bright and free in the lamplight. "I've wasted too much time running from happiness. I don't want to waste another day." The wedding took place the following Sunday in the small church in Cedar Falls, witnessed by the entire town and blessed by a circuit preacher who'd arrived just in time to perform the ceremony. Josie wore Sarah's best dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked from the meadow where she'd first told Colton about her daughter. Sheriff Martinez served as best man, and Mrs. Henderson cried through the entire ceremony while declaring it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed. Doc Henderson gave the bride away with all the pride of a father, and even the stern bank president who'd been threatening foreclosure seemed moved by the obvious joy radiating from the newly married couple. As they exchanged vows in voices that carried clearly through the small church, Colton found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Sarah's death had nearly destroyed him, but it had also opened his heart to the possibility of loving again. Josie's desperate flight from false accusations had brought her to his door just when he needed her most. Even Judge Crane's corruption had ultimately served to prove Josie's innocence and clear the way for their future together. "Do you, Colton Rig, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." The words came easily, backed by the full weight of his conviction. "Do you, Josie Mayfield, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." Her voice was clear and strong, carrying no trace of the uncertainty that had once defined her. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and reverent, a promise made in the presence of God and witnessed by a community that had watched them both struggle through loss and find healing in each other's love. When they turned to face their friends and neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Rigg, the applause was thunderous enough to rattle the windows. As they walked down the aisle together, Colton's hand secure in Josie's, he caught sight of the bent horseshoe he'd hung in the church entryway as a wedding decoration. For the first time since he'd found it, the horseshoe hung straight and true, as if it had finally found its proper purpose in blessing this new beginning. Outside the church, rice and flower petals filled the air as the entire town celebrated the union of two people who'd found love in the aftermath of loss. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility and grounded in the hard-won wisdom that came from understanding how precious and fragile happiness could be. They would face challenges, certainly. The ranch would demand endless work, and the memory of their losses would always be part of who they were. But they would face it all together, building something beautiful and lasting from the foundation of love they'd discovered in each other. As their wagon rolled through the gates of Black Mesa Ranch, heading home to begin their married life, both Colton and Josie knew they'd found something worth fighting for, worth cherishing, worth building a future around. Love had found them again, and this time they were determined never to let it go. The family portrait sat on the mantelpiece where Sarah's photograph had once been, its silver frame catching the morning light that streamed through the kitchen windows. In the picture, Colton and Josie stood side by side on the porch of their ranch house, their faces weathered by 2 years of shared work and worry, but their eyes bright with the contentment that came from lives well lived together. Josie paused in her breakfast preparations to study the photograph, marveling at how different the woman in the picture looked from the desperate fugitive who'd arrived at Black Mesa Ranch 3 years earlier. That woman had been running from her past, afraid to hope for anything beyond survival. This woman, Mrs. Colton Rigg, had roots as deep as the cottonwoods by the creek and dreams that stretched as far as the horizon. "Admiring your handsome husband?" Colton asked from the doorway, his voice warm with the gentle teasing that had become one of the daily pleasures of their marriage. "Admiring how far we've come," Josie replied, turning to smile at him. "Do you remember what you said the day I arrived, that you weren't looking for company?" "I remember. I also remember thinking you were trouble the minute I laid eyes on you." Colton moved to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist as they both looked at the portrait. "I was right about the trouble part. The best kind of trouble. The very best kind." Outside, the ranch showed the evidence of their joint efforts over the past 3 years. The bent horseshoe above the door had been straightened and polished until it gleamed, a symbol of things that could be repaired rather than discarded. The garden Sarah had started now flourished under Josie's care, producing enough vegetables to feed them through the winter, with plenty left over to share with neighbors. The cattle herd had grown steadily, and the financial ledgers showed numbers that would have seemed impossible during those dark months after Sarah's death. But the most profound changes weren't visible in account books or improvements to the property. They lived in the easy rhythm Colton and Josie had developed, the way they anticipated each other's needs and shared both burdens and joys. They lived in the laughter that filled rooms once heavy with grief, in the songs Josie hummed while she worked, in the way Colton had begun writing poetry again, this time sharing it freely instead of hiding it away. "The Patterson boy will be here this afternoon to help with the fence repairs," Josie said, settling into the comfortable routine of planning their day. "And Mrs. Henderson wants to know if we can spare some preserves for the church social next week." "Tell her yes to the preserves. We've got more than we can use, thanks to your way with the fruit trees." Colton poured coffee for both of them, the domestic gesture so natural it was hard to believe they'd lived any other way. "What about that letter from your cousin in Louisiana? Have you decided what to tell her?" The letter had arrived the week before, the first communication Josie had received from her family since she'd fled Texas under false accusations. Her cousin Marie had somehow learned of her marriage and wanted to rebuild the connection that had been severed by years and circumstances. It was an opportunity to reclaim part of her past, but also a reminder of the life she'd lost when she'd been forced to run. "I think I'll write back," Josie said thoughtfully. "Not to go back, this is my home now, but to let her know I'm well and happy. She has children, and it would be nice for them to know they have family out here if they ever want to visit. They'd be welcome. This house is big enough for visitors, and it's been too quiet since Doc Henderson recovered from his pneumonia." The old doctor had become a frequent guest at their table, drawn by Josie's cooking and the warmth of their hospitality. He'd appointed himself unofficial grandfather to the family they were building, offering advice that was usually wise and occasionally meddlesome. His presence had helped fill some of the empty spaces in their lives, reminding them both that family could be chosen as well as inherited. "There's something else," Josie said, her tone carefully casual, in the way that meant she had news she wasn't sure how to share. "Something I've been meaning to tell you." Colton looked at her more carefully, noting the slight flush in her cheeks and the way she was avoiding his eyes. "What is it?" Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday when he came to check on the Henderson baby. Josie's smile was soft and wondering, as if she couldn't quite believe her own words. "We're going to have a baby, Colton. Come spring, we'll be 3 instead of 2. The coffee cup slipped from Colton's suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a crash that neither of them noticed. For a moment, he could only stare at her, trying to process news that seemed too wonderful to be real. "A baby?" he whispered. "A baby?" Josie's smile grew brighter at his obvious joy. "I know we never talked about it, and I know we're not young anymore, but—" Whatever else she might have said was lost, as Colton swept her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen while she laughed and protested that he'd make her dizzy. When he finally set her down, his eyes were bright with tears he made no effort to hide. "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy?" Colton cupped her face in his hands, marveling at the gift life had given them. "Josie, I thought my chance for children died with Sarah. I never imagined, never dreamed." He stopped, overwhelmed by emotions too large for words. "Neither did I. After losing Emma, after all the years with Thomas when we hoped but never," Josie's voice caught slightly, "I thought that part of my life was over. But maybe we get second chances at more than just love." They spent the rest of the morning making plans and sharing dreams, talking about cribs and names, and all the changes a baby would bring to their carefully ordered life. The future that had once seemed empty now stretched before them, rich with possibilities, sleepless nights and first steps, school days and birthday parties, all the ordinary miracles of raising a child together. "What would you like?" Colton asked as they walked through the garden, checking on the late tomatoes and planning next year's expansion. "A boy or a girl?" "Healthy," Josie replied immediately. "Everything else is just details." A practical answer from a practical woman. "Though I have to admit, a little girl would be nice. Someone to teach my preserving recipes to, someone to carry on the traditions we're building here. And a boy could learn the ranch work, carry on the family name. Either way, they'll know they're wanted. They'll know they were born from love and raised with purpose." Josie stopped beside the apple tree that had produced their best crop yet, its branches heavy with fruit that would soon be turned into the preserves Mrs. Henderson admired so much. "That's more than many children get." As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Colton and Josie stood together on the porch where their love story had truly begun. The ranch spread before them in all directions, their life's work made visible in every fence line and building, every growing thing they'd nurtured together. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Josie asked, her head resting on Colton's shoulder. "If I hadn't answered your advertisement, if you'd chosen someone else?" "Every day," Colton admitted, "and every day I'm grateful you were brave enough to take a chance on a grieving widower who didn't know what he was looking for. You knew. You just didn't trust yourself to believe you could find it." The bent horseshoe above the door caught the last rays of sunlight. No longer a symbol of luck gone wrong, but a reminder that broken things could be mended, that what seemed ruined could be made beautiful again. Below it, the family they were building prepared to welcome its newest member, secure in the knowledge that love multiplied rather than divided, that hearts broken by loss could still have room for infinite joy. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Colton thought about the letters he'd never sent to Sarah, the words of love he'd been too afraid to speak. This time would be different. This time he would tell his wife every day how much she meant to him, would write poetry for his child, would never again let fear keep him from expressing the fullness of his heart. The future stretched before them, bright with promise and grounded in the hard-won wisdom that came from understanding how precious and fragile happiness could be. They would face whatever came together, building something beautiful and lasting from the foundation of love they'd discovered in each other. Some men bury their hearts with their wives, but Colton Rigg had learned that the heart could hold more than one great love, that second chances could be just as sweet as first ones, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories began with the words, "I can make you feel love again." In the growing darkness of the high desert night, with his wife in his arms and a child growing beneath her heart, Colton Rigg knew that Josie Mayfield had kept her promise in ways neither of them could have imagined. She had indeed made him feel love again, not just for her, but for life itself, for the future they would build together, and for all the quiet miracles still waiting to unfold.